it's about that time, so I'm going to start recording, and then we'll jump right in with 2 feet. So I assume at this point everyone can hear me. If you can't, please let me know. So good morning, my friends. So the first thing I want to do is go over a couple of announcements. So you're going to have your first online practical, and the way it's going to work, it's going to open at 8 a.m. on Thursday. That's this Thursday, and it will remain open until Friday at midnight, technically 11:59. If you can't remember what we covered, here's the list of labs that we covered. Also, I sent this in an email to you this morning, so you can check your email, and all this information is included. A couple other things about the practical. The practical contains 50 questions, and you have 42 minutes to complete them. A couple of additional things to keep in mind. There will be no backtracking allowed with this exam. You're going to get an image and a question about that image one at a time, and you can't backtrack. So once you answer the question and move on to the next question, you won't be able to go back. Also, the Quizlets will not be available while the practical is open. So if you think you're going to study using the Quizlets up until Friday and take the practical then, the Quizlets are not going to be available, at least not the ones that I have created. Now, the reason why I have this strict time limit, the reason why I'm not allowing backtracking, and the reason why the Quizlets are not available is because I don't want students to cheat. And if you give people the opportunity to cheat, there are a percentage that will. That's just a fact of life. And so I'm giving the same amount of time that I typically give you to complete each question when you take a lecture quiz online, right? Usually you have 10 minutes to complete 12 questions. That's about 0.8 minutes per question. And in those situations, you have to read each of the possible multiple choice answers to figure out which one's correct. In this case, in most cases, you're looking at the image, you're reading the question, and then you're answering what is it, right? So it really shouldn't take that long. You look at something, and either you know what nerve that is, or what muscle that is, or you don't. So slightly less than a minute per question is plenty of time. I don't want to give people taking the exam time to look online, to try to Google, to try to go through their notes and that sort of thing. It's not fair to those people who play by the rules. Okay? So that's the situation with the practical. Now, the practical, like the lab quizzes, will give you a preliminary score, but then I have to go in and hand grade each one, because if my answer that I put into the computer is slightly different from what you answer, like misspelled words, if you use plural and I use singular or something like that, it'll count it wrong. So once I go in over the weekend and hand grade them, I'll send an email letting you know that I've graded all of them, and you should look at your updated result. Okay. All right. I want to do a quick checkup before we go into the next. Before we continue on, I want to do I want to do a brief check. So I have created, if I can find them, I have created using Quizlet some flashcards, right? So I'm gonna ask a question, and then you think about. I'm gonna give you about 5-6 seconds to answer, right? And then I'll flip the card. So first question: what organ secretes aldosterone? And then just answer to yourself. Okay, I'm not asking you to type it in or whatever, right? But what organ secretes aldosterone? 5 seconds. The adrenal cortex secretes aldosterone. It also secretes cortisone, cortisol, and the sex hormones. Oh, gosh. All right, list the 6 steroid hormones. List the 6 steroid hormones. 3 seconds. Well, maybe I should give you a few more. Okay, have you come up with them? All right. The 6 steroid hormones are testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. Just remember the sex steroids. And then you have the corticosteroids. Those are the steroids produced by the adrenal cortex: aldosterone, cortisone, and cortisol. Why are those important? Well, those are the 6 that work by binding directly to the DNA in their target cells. So that's why it's important to know them. All right, next question. What is the target organ for antidiuretic hormone? What is the target organ for antidiuretic hormone? 5 seconds. It is the kidneys. Remember that antidiuresis is the production of urine. Well, what does antidiuretic hormone does? It decreases production of urine by the kidneys. All right, what are the 6 hormones released by the anterior pituitary gland? Remember, 4 of them are tropic hormones, but there are 6. 6 hormones released by the anterior pituitary gland. Five seconds. They are growth hormone, prolactin, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone. All right, what is the effect of the thyroid hormones? T3 and T4. What's the effect of the thyroid hormones? What effects do they have? Five seconds. Answer, they increase the metabolic rate. Pretty much every cell in the body is a target cell for thyroid hormone, and it increases the production of ATP and the utilization of ATP. Alrighty, what stimulates the secretion of cortisol? What stimulates the secretion of cortisol? Five seconds. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, produced by the anterior pituitary gland, targets the adrenal cortex, which then causes the production of cortisol, one of the glucocorticoids. What hormone produced by the anterior pituitary gland is regulated by positive feedback? Oh, actually, this is incorrect. It should be the posterior pituitary gland. It's regulated by anterior. So it should say what hormone produced by the posterior pituitary gland is regulated by positive feedback. I apologize. I'll have to edit that. There's only one hormone that we're gonna discuss that's regulated by positive feedback, and that is oxytocin. Oxytocin is the only hormone regulated by positive feedback. All others are regulated by negative feedback or no feedback at all. What is the target organ for follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones? One of the last hormones we talked about. Well, follicle-stimulating hormone we did, luteinizing hormone we haven't yet, but you should know that anyway. Follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. What organ do they target, or organs do they target? Well, FSH and LH are also called the gonadotropins because they target the gonads, the testes, and the ovaries. All right, wrapping things up. What's the target organ or tissue for oxytocin? Target organ or tissue for oxytocin. Five seconds. Smooth muscle, like in the uterus, during the birthing process, parturition, labor contractions, and the breasts, such as what happens during letdown, during suckling. And lastly, number 10, what's the target organ for prolactin? Target organ for prolactin. Just think of what the word means. Prolactin. Easy peasy, right? 5 seconds. The mammary glands or the breasts, they help maintain production of milk by the breasts after birthing. Okay, cool. So it's a little review there I thought we would have before moving on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to build out that Quizlet, and I'll have that available for you to study for the endocrine system as well. So far, all of the Quizlets I've done specifically have been for lab. I'm also going to add one for the endocrine system specifically. I don't know if I'll have the time to create them for all lecture organ systems we're going to cover. I will definitely do that for the lab, but I will definitely do it for the endocrine system. Students, I think the endocrine system, what you have to know, lends itself very well to studying using Quizlets. So. Okay, so that was our little quick checkup. So we're going to continue where we left off on Friday. So on Friday, we began to talk about the last hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland. We'd already talked about growth hormone and prolactin, and then we went on to talk about our first two tropic hormones, thyrotropic hormone or thyroid stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone or ACTH. Now we're moving to the gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone or FSH, and luteinizing hormone or LH. These are collectively referred to as the gonadotropins. Remember, tropic hormones are hormones that target other endocrine organs or hormone producing tissues and organs. Because these specifically target the gonads, they're referred to as the gonadotropins. And the first one we talked about was follicle stimulating hormone. And its name tells you what it does. So this is an ovary here, and ovaries, of course, produce an oocyte through a process called ovulation, the rupturing of a follicle. You could think of ovulation as like a red apple falling off a tree. Prior to ovulation, though, or prior to that apple falling off the tree, it goes through a ripening process, and so does a follicle. It starts off what's called as an immature or primary follicle, and it goes through this process of ripening, and that precedes ovulation. Well, that ripening process is stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone, right? So that follicle is literally stimulated to go through that process by follicle stimulating hormone. And as that follicle matures, it produces more and more estrogen. So follicle stimulating hormone also leads to production of estrogen by the ovary. So what does follicle stimulating hormone do in males? Well, in the testes, when a male is born, right, as an infant, he has in his testes these stem cells. They're called daughter A stem cells. And daughter A stem cells pretty much produce more daughter A stem cells. Then one day that male hits puberty and FSH levels rise in the blood. And they cause some of those type A cells to become type B stem cells. And type B stem cells can produce more type B stem cells, and they can also produce spermatozoa or sperm cells. So that's what happens when at the onset of puberty. Now all of a sudden the male can produce sperm because he has high levels of FSH or elevated levels of FSH. Okay, let's look now at luteinizing hormone. So we talked about that last Friday, but I thought it was appropriate to cover it again. Luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is the other gonadotropin produced by the anterior pituitary gland. So what does it do in females? So in females, it's actually responsible for ovulation. So luteinizing hormone actually causes the apple to fall from the tree, right? It triggers ovulation or the rupturing of this follicle. So follicle stimulating hormone is responsible for the ripening process that precedes ovulation. Luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation, and specifically you have to have this spike in luteinizing hormone in the blood. Luteinizing hormone, what it does is it actually increases, and you get what's called this luteinizing this LH surge, where it peaks, and that's what actually triggers ovulation. And in fact, if you don't get that peak, if luteinizing hormone doesn't rise high enough, ovulation never occurs. Now, why is luteinizing hormone called luteinizing hormone? Well, it's because what's left over after ovulation, the remainder of that follicle, is called the corpus luteum. And what's important about the corpus luteum is it continues to produce estrogen and it produces progesterone. So luteinizing hormone leads to the production of progesterone by the ovaries, in addition to causing ovulation. So what does luteinizing hormone do in males? Stimulates testosterone production by the testes, right? So luteinizing hormone causes the testes to produce testosterone. Okay, so LH and FSH stimulate the gonads to produce the sex hormones. So let's now talk about those sex hormones. So estrogen is produced by Graafian follicles in the ovaries. So as those follicles are maturing, they produce estrogens, but estrogen is also produced by the placenta, and we'll talk about that a little later. But the placenta, which is basically the connection between the fetal circulation and the maternal circulation in a pregnant mother, it actually produces estrogens. What do estrogens do? Well, estrogens are responsible for stimulating secondary sex characteristics in females. So they're responsible for the development of breasts. They're responsible for pubic hair in the axillary regions. Pubic hair in the pubic regions, and axillary hair under the arms. Also responsible for maturing of the female reproductive organs. And if ovulation occurs in a female, it helps prepare the uterus to receive that egg. And if you actually have pregnancy occur where you have a fertilized ovum, it helps maintain pregnancy and stop menses. which is the detachment of the endometrium from the uterus. It prevents that from detaching during pregnancy, and along with prolactin and progesterone, it prepares the breast to produce milk in a pregnant female. So those are all of the different functions of estrogens. We don't go deep into estrogens and their functions in the endocrine system because that's covered on your take-home exam in the reproductive system chapter. What about progesterone? So progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum after ovulation. So what do you think progesterone does? Well, progesterone helps bring about the menstrual cycle. So progesterone maintains the endometrium that vascular layer that lines the uterus. Why is that important? Well, think of what's happening here after ovulation. So now we have this oocyte that's moving down the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes toward the uterus. What if it were to become fertilized? Well, we want to make sure that vascular blood-filled layer lining the uterus doesn't slough off, doesn't detach, and is excreted as what happens during menses. So what progesterone does is it basically causes that layer to remain in the uterus because, hey, this oocyte could get fertilized and it would need to implant. So progesterone maintains that uterine layer. Also, it prepares the breast for lactation if fertilization occurs. Now, what if fertilization doesn't occur? Well, eventually this corpus luteum degenerates, progesterone levels fall, as do estrogen levels, and then you get the typical menstrual cycle where you have the endometrium detaching and then passing through out of the uterus, through the vagina, and then out the body. But it's this progesterone that's produced at large amounts right after ovulation, and if there's no implantation, then there's less and less progesterone produced, and you get the menstrual cycle. All right, let's look at regulation. So recall this hypothalamus that stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to produce luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone that then targets the ovaries and causes the production of progesterone and estrogen. Progesterone and estrogen, meanwhile, feed back on the pituitary gland as well as the hypothalamus. So in other words, as progesterone levels and estrogen levels increase in the blood, they will tend to decrease further release of LH and FSH. Now remember, I said that in order for ovulation to occur, you have to have this surge in LH. In other words, LH levels have to peak. What would prevent LH levels from peaking, do you think? Well, if progesterone levels and estrogen levels were high enough, you would stop the LH surge. And that's basically what happens by use of the pill as a contraceptive. During a certain part of the month, the pill contains either progesterone, estrogen, or a combination. And it's a high enough level that it suppresses the release of LH. If you don't get that LH surge, then you don't get ovulation. If there's no ovulation, there's no possibility of fertilization. And in general, this is how the pill works. This is also what happens during pregnancy. During pregnancy, you have high estrogen and high progesterone levels. So basically, by using the pill as a contraceptive, you're fooling the body into thinking that you're already pregnant. So if you're already pregnant, well, we don't need to ovulate anymore. So that's basically how the pill works. Let's now talk about the male sex hormones. So you have these cells called interstitial cells, and you don't have to know that, but I'd like to be specific. In the testes that produce the androgens. The androgens are your male sex hormones, and there's several of them. The most important one is testosterone, and certainly it's the one that we're most familiar with. Testosterone is responsible for the secondary sex characteristics in men. It promotes growth, maturation, and maintenance of the reproductive organs. Also causes the growth of axillary hair as well as pubic hair. Increases the size of muscles, which tends to enhance bone density as well. Causes the changes in your larynx, which leads to a deeper voice in some people more than others, and it's required for normal sperm cell production. Control of the testes and control of LH and FSH is regulated by negative feedback, similar to in females. As LH levels and FSH levels increase, that increases the production of testosterone, and testosterone inhibits further release of LH and FSH directly on the anterior pituitary gland, but also feeds back on the hypothalamus, decreasing the release of the hormones that stimulated the release of LH and FSH. Okay, so those are all of the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. And in the case of the tropic hormones, we've also covered the hormones that they produce as well as their effects. Now we're going to move away from these hormones and the hormones produced in response to these anterior pituitary hormones. And the first hormones we're going to cover are calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. You know, actually, let me stop for a second and ask if there are questions. So are there any questions at this time? Please don't be shy about asking questions. You can type a question in, or you can raise your hand. I'll recognize you. You can unmute your mic and feel free to ask a question. We've got 31 students. No one has one question. Everything is just like 100% you understand. No muddy. You're not muddy on any point. Okay, well, if there are no questions, I guess I'll move on to the next topic. Before we move on, though, I just want to reiterate that what you need to know for all of these hormones that we've talked about so far, if I can get to, right, are these: the organ or tissue that releases it, where that organ or tissue is found, the target organ or tissue, stimulation of secretion, effects, chemistry and mechanism of action, and regulation of secretion. For the sex hormones, don't worry so much about the target organ or tissue, because there's multiple target organs and tissues. But certainly for FSH and LH, know the target organ or tissue are the gonads. Okay, so let's get back to calcitonin and parathyroid hormones. So again, now we are talking about hormones now that have no relationship to the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so we're moving away from the pituitary gland completely, and we're moving to organs that have no relationship or no formal relationship with the pituitary gland. And we're going to start with calcitonin, which is produced by the thyroid gland, and parathyroid hormone produced by the parathyroid gland, of course. And you're already somewhat familiar with these hormones because we talked about them when we talked about the skeletal system. So you want to describe calcitonin and parathyroid hormone and explain how they maintain blood calcium homeostasis. So I introduced this to you earlier when we were talking about the thyroid gland, but the thyroid gland produces the hormone calcitonin, but it's produced by different cells in the thyroid gland that produce T3 and I mentioned that when you hear the term thyroid hormones, usually it's what's being referred to is not calcitonin. It's T3 and T4. But calcitonin is produced by the thyroid gland, and it is secreted in response to high blood calcium. So you'd expect calcitonin levels to rise after you drink milk or consume something that had high levels of calcium in it. Its purpose is to bring the calcium levels back down to normal. How does calcitonin do that? We'll just think about, well, what are the inputs and what are the losses of calcium from the blood? Well, if calcitonin is going to decrease blood calcium levels, it can do that by increasing the activity of osteoblasts, causing those osteoblasts to deposit more calcium into bone, and it can cause loss of calcium from the blood by increasing the amount that is excreted by the kidneys and urine. So calcitonin is going to cause increased calcium levels in your urine, trying to get calcium levels back down to normal. Parathyroid glands are these glands that are close to and sometimes on top of the thyroid gland. That's why they're called parathyroid glands. Para meaning like around or near to. These are little tiny masses that produce parathyroid hormones. Probably like the easiest hormone to remember what produces it. Parathyroid hormone produced by parathyroid glands. What does it do? Well, it's antagonistic to calcitonin. It increases blood calcium levels. So if you're not getting sufficient amounts of calcium in your diet, it's going to be, and blood calcium levels begin to fall, it's going to stimulate removal of calcium from your bone by the osteoclasts. It's going to reduce the amount of calcium that's lost from in your urine from the kidneys. So it's going to cause your kidneys to reabsorb or keep more calcium in the blood. And it's also going to stimulate intestinal absorption of calcium, right? And all of these actions are going to serve to increase calcium levels in the blood. So its target organs are the intestines, the kidneys, as well as the bones. And if you recall, if you're not receiving sufficient amounts of calcium in your diet, and this occurs over a very long period of time, that can lead to osteoporosis. And the reason why is you're going to have these high levels of parathyroid hormone circulating over long periods of time. And that is going to cause excessive bone resorption. So your body is trying to maintain blood calcium levels by pulling it off your bone via parathyroid hormone. Okay? In addition to parathyroid hormone increasing or enhancing calcium absorption from the blood, from the small intestine, and also decreasing the amount that's excreted by the kidneys. This figure here is a figure that you can use to make sure you understand how calcitonin and parathyroid hormone regulates calcium homeostasis in the blood. If you can explain this figure, right, then you understand how calcitonin and parathyroid hormone regulate calcium levels. So if you have a high level of calcium in your blood, it causes the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. Gosh, I've just completely screwed this up. Let me begin again. If you have a elevated level of calcium in your blood. It causes the thyroid gland to produce calcitonin. Calcitonin targets the osteoblasts in your bones, causing them to deposit more calcium in your bone. Also increases calcium loss in by the kidneys into the urine. That will cause a decrease in blood calcium levels back down to normal levels. If blood calcium levels are low, let's say you're not getting sufficient amounts in your diet, that decrease in blood calcium levels in the blood will cause the parathyroid gland to produce parathyroid hormones. That will cause the osteoclasts to resorb more bone, releasing calcium into the blood, bringing calcium levels back to normal. Also decreases calcium lost in the kidney, lost in urine via the kidneys. Also enhances calcium absorption from the small intestine. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone working together help regulate blood calcium levels. Interestingly enough, calcitonin doesn't appear to be essential for life. If your body's not producing sufficient amounts of calcitonin, it doesn't appear to have any negative effects. Parathyroid hormone, however, is required for life. In fact, if one were to have your thyroid gland removed, and if it takes all the parathyroid glands with it, you would die unless provided with a outside source of parathyroid hormone. Okay, so as I said, calcitonin is not required for life. Doesn't appear to be any major consequences if your thyroid gland isn't producing sufficient amounts, but we know that parathyroid hormone is required for life. In fact, before it was known that parathyroid glands existed, patients would have their thyroid glands removed, and a certain number of those patients that had their thyroid glands removed for other reasons, right, would die within 3 days. Later, it was recognized that these parathyroid glands existed, and it was also recognized that they increased blood calcium levels, and without them, what we know is that you will die. Okay, questions about calcitonin and parathyroid hormone? As I'm waiting for someone to ask a question, one thing I do want to give you a little way of distinguishing between these two hormones, because what I find is a lot of times students can't remember which one does. They remember that they both regulate blood calcium levels, but they can't remember which one increases it, which one decreases it. So what I tell students, remember, parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels, and calcitonin tones it down, brings it down. So if you can remember, calcitonin tones down calcium levels, then you can remember parathyroid hormone increase. All right, let's now talk about the adrenal medulla hormones. We've already talked about the hormones of the adrenal cortex. Let's talk about the hormones of the adrenal medulla, which is epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. Okay, and then we're going to explain the role that these hormones, that the adrenal gland hormones play in the stress response. All righty, so we touched on the role that epinephrine and norepinephrine played in the sympathetic nervous system. So this is just sort of adding to the body of knowledge that you already know. So you are aware that the sympathetic nervous system sends nerve impulses out to the adrenal medulla, and that results in the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. And then those hormones are taken all throughout the body. And what do? Well, they basically reinforce the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system helps prepare the body for an increased level of activity. It enhances blood flow to your skeletal muscles. It increases your heart rate. It increases your respiration rate. It dilates your pupils. It blood flow to your urinary tract, your kidneys, to your digestive tract. It dilates blood. It dilates the respiratory passages. All right, it's all about getting sufficient amounts of oxygen to your skeletal muscles in order to prepare the body for a increase in activity. So basically, the adrenal medulla and its hormones, the epinephrine and norepinephrine, basically reinforce the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. In fact, you can live without your adrenal medulla. If it were damaged or for whatever reason didn't function, the sympathetic nervous system provides enough sympathetic activity that you would live fine. So adrenaline and noradrenaline, I've sort of got a little ahead of my slides here, are also referred to as the catecholamines. They are amines, nitrogen-containing amines, and so they're also referred to as the catecholamines. As I said, they're preparing the body for increased level of activity, increased heart rate, blood pressure, dilate the passageways of the lungs, trying to make oxygen and glucose available to the organs that need it during times of stress. Okay, allows the body to deal with short-term stresses. Okay, short-term stresses. Exercise, dealing with a temporary stressful situation like an exam or some type of physical trial. This is the extreme of this would be the fight or flight response. As I mentioned, they are amines, so they are non-steroid hormones, so they're going to work through second messengers. Before moving on, I do want to talk a little bit about the role that the catecholamines as well as the adrenal corticosteroids play in the overall stress response of the body. So you could think of the body responding to stress as you could divide stress sort of into two categories. You have short-term stress shown here on the left, and you have long-term or prolonged stress shown here on the right. Now, first of all, let's define what stress is versus a stressor. A stressor is a challenge to homeostasis. It's a challenge to homeostasis. So running, for example, let's say you're going to go and exercise for 30 minutes, right? The stressor is the exercise. Being able to run for 30 minutes is going to tax the body, right? It's going to require getting sufficient amounts of oxygen to the muscles of the body. So the stressor is the act of running. The stress response is, well, how does the body respond to that? Well, there's going to be increase in heart rate. There's going to be dilation of blood vessels to the muscles. There's going to be increase in blood pressure, so forth and so on, right? The stress is how a body responds to a stressor. So in a short-term stress, that involves the catecholamines from the adrenal medulla, right? What happens? You get the sympathetic nervous system causing the release of those catecholamines, and you get increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure. Liver helps maintain blood glucose levels, so forth and so on. In the case of if it's exclusively a short-term stress, like I'm running for 30 minutes, or even running for several hours or something like that, then once that stressor is relieved, then the period of stress is over. However, if that stress is prolonged, like let's say you're in a car accident, and then from that car accident, there's extensive damage, and then there's surgery that occurs after that, right? And so there's significant trauma to the body that's going to take several days, maybe even weeks. for the body to recover. Well, then we're moving from short-term stress to long-term stress. And during long-term stress, we have to worry about the body dehydrating. We have to worry about running out of maintaining blood sugar levels. And the hormones that are going to primarily deal with prolonged stress are the mineralocorticoids and the glucocorticoids. The glucocorticoids are, let's start with the mineralocorticoids. The mineralocorticoids are going to help to maintain blood hydration levels, maintaining blood pressure, maintaining blood volume. And the glucocorticoids are going to help maintain blood sugar levels. At the same time, they're also going to help suppress the immune system, because during this process of recovery, the immune system could get out of hand and actually do more damage than good. This short-term stress is called the alarm stage. After the alarm stage, the body moves to the resistance stage. So when you're recovering from surgery, you're going to the resistance stage. Okay? Now, after the resistance stage, there is no third stage. What either happens is either you recover or you die. So we go from the alarm stage to resistance stage to recovery or death. Okay, so just a reminder, for all those hormones we've talked about, you have to know the following. Okay, organ tissue release, location, target, stimulation of secretion, effects, chemistry and mechanism of action, and regulation of secretion. Okay, so I want to talk about one of my favorite hormones or group of hormones, which is insulin and glucagon. These hormones help maintain blood sugar levels. Now, this is the first time where you also have to know about a disease or disorder that involves hormones. In the previous diseases or disorders I've talked about, I only shared them with you as a way for you understanding the hormones better. But I said you didn't have to know these diseases. Because diabetes is so prevalent in our society, I do want you to be familiar with diabetes. Okay, let's jump into insulin. It's produced by the pancreas. The pancreas is a mixed gland. It produces both hormones, and it also produces exocrine substances like bicarbonate and digestive enzymes. But we're going to focus on its endocrine function. So it produces insulin. It has what are called beta cells, and the beta cells produce insulin in response to an increase in blood sugar. So usually after you eat a meal, glucose levels rise, and in response, the beta cells of the pancreas release insulin. What does insulin do? Well, it targets pretty much all the cells of the body, and it causes those cells to activate glucose transporters, and they transport glucose from the extracellular fluid into the cells. Okay? Insulin also specifically targets the liver, and it causes the liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. Remember, glycogen is an animal's starch. It is the storage form of glucose. Let's see if I changed this. No, I didn't. So this video is not going to work for me, but I have a video that explains how insulin works, and it also explains type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes occurs when beta cells are either absent or they aren't functioning normally. They don't produce enough insulin. Type 1 diabetes typically occurs in youth, and it's due to the destruction of those beta cells by the patient's own immune system. So the situation is you don't have beta cells or they don't work. So you don't have sufficient amounts of insulin, so the individual cannot regulate their blood insulin levels normally. That's type 1 diabetes, also referred to as child onset diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, you have the beta cells, they make insulin, but the body doesn't respond to the insulin. So in other words, that insulin binds the receptors, but nothing happens, right? This used to be referred to as adult onset because it used to be that we only saw type 2 diabetes, or almost always you saw it in adults. However, with an increase in childhood obesity, we see type 2 diabetes more and more in younger people. In fact, childhood obesity or an increase in body weight increases your risk of diabetes type 2. The antagonistic hormone for insulin is glucagon. Glucagon is also produced by the pancreas. It's specifically produced by alpha cells of the pancreas. And what does it do? It decreases blood glucose levels. It targets the liver. Remember, the liver stored glucose as glycogen after a meal. When you're between meals, glucagon is going to cause the liver to break that glycogen down and release it into the blood to maintain blood sugar levels during between meals. Okay, so glucagon and insulin are antagonistic. They regulate the same variable, which is blood sugar levels, but they have different effects. Okay, this figure right here, like the figure that I shared with you for explaining how calcitonin and parathyroid hormone regulate blood calcium levels. Similarly, this figure is excellent for making sure you understand how insulin and glucagon regulate blood sugar levels. So when you eat let's say you eat a jelly donut, blood sugar levels are going to rise. That's going to cause the pancreas to release insulin. That insulin is going to cause all the cells of the body to take up glucose. Specifically, it's going to cause the liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. And that's going to bring your blood sugar levels back down to normal. If you're between meals, or let's say you've been studying like A&P for the last 8 hours and you haven't done anything but drank water, right? Your blood sugar levels are going to fall. That's going to cause the alpha cells to release glucagon. Glucagon is going to target the liver, causing it to break glycogen down to glucose, and that's going to bring your blood sugar levels back up to normal, right? So glucagon and insulin help regulate blood sugar levels, okay? Because insulin is produced when blood sugar levels rise, which is typically after a meal, and glucagon is produced when blood sugar levels fall, which is between meals. Insulin is often referred to as the hormone of feasting, and glucagon is referred to as the hormone of fasting. Okay, so before we go, had something to share with you, and I'm trying to think of what it is. So, I know we didn't finish. We didn't finish the endocrine system, but I literally have like 4 more slides. So we'll finish that on Wednesday, and we'll start the chapter on blood. Okay, so yeah, I said it's unlikely we're going to start today, and of course we didn't. So we're going to start the chapter on blood on Wednesday. So read chapter 10 up to blood and blood typing, all right, so that you're prepared for class on Wednesday. Okay, so at this point I will stop and answer questions, and I see I have a question from Michelle, and as soon as I get back to my screen here, I'll be more than happy to answer it. Yes, so it's type 1, also called insulin-dependent diabetes. Yes, it is, because since the body is not produced, you have diabetes, or you have elevated levels of blood sugar because the body is not producing its own. All right, Sandy, question.
What happens when someone is hypoglycemic?
So when someone is hypoglycemic, I believe what you have is, so hypoglycemic means they have a lower than normal level of blood sugar. So they're like the opposite of diabetes. Okay. I believe that in most cases that is due to a hyper secretion of glucagon. Other questions? Yes, insulin is the hormone of feasting, and glucagon is a hormone of fasting. Let's see here. I wanted to. So I was looking, trying to see if I could find. Went to the Mayo Clinic, trying to find reasons for hypoglycemia. You don't hear of it much, and what they do say on here is the most common. There can be several reasons. The most common case is too much, as a diabetic, taking too much insulin. But I wanted to see what I thought I had read that for non-diabetics, hypoglycemia was usually due to hypersecretion of glucagon, but I wanted to confirm that.
Thank you.
You are very welcome. Let's see here. Low blood glucose. Yeah, everything is being, they're talking about hypoglycemia in the context of diabetes. I'm trying to find it where they just talk about it by itself. If I do hypoglycemia without diabetes, what causes hypoglycemia without diabetes? Drinking too much alcohol. Let's see here. Medical news today. Drinking too much alcohol, medication, anorexia, hepatitis, adrenal and pituitary gland disorders, kidney problems, pancreatic tumors. Certainly, if there's hypersecretion of insulin, that can cause hypoglycemia. Which of these is more prevalent? I don't know. What I can tell you is that alcohol seems to be toxic to the pancreas. One of the let me stop